Dr. Rebecca Sockbeson from the Faculty of Education, Department of Educational Policy Studies, who's going to talk about Indigenous education, Indigenous knowledge mobilization, a purposeful collaboration between higher education and Aboriginal communities. Thank you.
I just want to start off by locating myself and a little bit about what qualifies me to do the research beyond the PhD. I'm of the Penobscot Indian Nation down east in Maine in the Maritimes of the Wabanaki Confederacy. I'm married to Reginald Cardinal of the Alexis Nakota Sioux Nation. He's also the Assistant Dean of Native Studies. I coordinate the Indigenous Peoples Education specialization here in the Faculty of Education. It's one of the most long-standing doctoral conferring programs in North America that expects graduate students to engage through their own ancestral Indigenous epistemological lens. I'm also the co-applicant of that research is senior scholar and elder Dr. Cora Weber-Pilwax of Calling Lake. She's one of the first Aboriginal professors here at the U of A, and I just want to especially acknowledge her. She's right here. And finally, I want to say Aboshtet Ishnish Chief Tony Alexis, if you could just stand and be acknowledged. Thank you. Thank you for your visionary leadership. Chief Tony Alexis is also on this research team, okay, as well as Dr. Claudine Lewis, who is the president of Musqueam's Cultural College, who's not able to join us today. Okay. Because I have 3 minutes, I'm going to read from a piece of paper. I have lots of information that I want to make sure it gets covered. Indigenous knowledge mobilization is a response to legislated Indigenous knowledge dispossession via the Indian Act of 1876 and Indian residential school system. The primary source of knowledge transfer for Aboriginal peoples is ceremony and language. The Indian Act prohibited our ceremonies, and the Indian residential schools restricted the speaking of our languages. Remember, both primary sources of Indigenous knowledge transfer. Hence, legislated Indigenous knowledge dispossession. Okay? The largest national class action suit against Canada led to the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement of 2007, which mandated 5 components to the Canadian government in order to redress, which is to make right the crimes committed. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission and subsequent calls to action are efforts of that legal responsibility of making right those crimes committed. Indigenous knowledge recovery is called for within the 94 calls to action, specifically in number 62 and 65. Universities like us are called upon to support Indigenous knowledge recovery. The image you see here are teepees just across the river at Rossdale Flats, just below the legislative building in the early 1900s. Ceremonies were likely not happening inside as they had been prohibited at this point, for over 20 years. Meanwhile, in the legislative building just above the teepees, the University Act was being struck and drafted. And just across the river where we sit today here at the U of A was being developed to be one day and today renowned as one of the leading research institutions in Canada, a vessel of knowledge. During the same time, our ancestors of Treaty 6 were being legally dispossessed of their primary sources of knowledge transfer, language, and ceremony. The research question guiding this work is, how can Indigenous communities and universities purposefully engage to develop an educational policy framework for sustainable Indigenous knowledge mobilization? This research calls for the voice of Aboriginal communities of Treaty 6 territory, including but not limited to the Alexis Nakota Sioux Nation and Musqueam's Cultural College, to respond to how higher education, how we are doing at the reconciliation efforts, particularly in the context of Indigenous knowledge recovery. Building a coordinated Aboriginal community response, which is an institutional ethnography, will feed into a policy framework offered to higher education that will work toward knowledge recovery for the benefit of Indigenous communities. And this is a key component of the research, so that Indigenous knowledge is being taken up with the support of higher ed in order to benefit Indigenous communities toward Indigenous knowledge recovery, okay? So I want to thank SSHRC for recognizing this research and these types of efforts. It helps to fulfill a notion that eminent Maori Indigenous scholar Linda Tahatway Smith reminds us of toward the end of her seminal book, Decolonizing Methodologies. She asks us, what happens to the research when those who have been historically researched are actually doing and leading the research? So it's with that that I thank SSHRC for supporting these efforts, and for all of the research team and individuals. Thank you for your time and listening to this work.